I will be helping co-host with the webinar Sneak Peek at Ownership-Based Authorization in Ed-Fi. I have Vinaya here and Sai who are going to lead the webinar. We also will be recording this and sending it out in an email. If you need to recap anything or look at the presentation, or if you want to share it with coworkers. We also have contact information in here if you want to reach out regarding any other questions. And with that being said, I'm going to kick it off to Saeed.
Thank you, Lauren. Just to give an introduction about myself, my name is Sai Srinivasan, and I'm the solutions architect with Ed-Fi, and I have been with Ed-Fi for the past 5 years. I come from the Department of Education of the state of Nevada prior to this job, and have a passion in the education space. So good to meet you all. So the agenda for today is we're going to be doing an insight into what the record level ownership is as part of the core implementation. But I would like to take a few minutes to describe you the use cases that we have heard from the field. You all know in a state level implementation, LEAs submit the data for students who are attending their own district, as well as for students attending private day schools. This is a scenario that we have seen in Arizona, and I'm sure that this scenario is not unique to Arizona. There are other states who are sending their kids over to a private school. And this may be the scenario where they want the students to receive some special services from that private school those services are not being offered by the resident district or the submitting district. So in this scenario, multiple LEAs could be sending the kids over to the private day schools. So what is the problem in this scenario, right? The problem here is vendor systems, when they do a data sync with the Ed-Fi ODS, oftentimes they inadvertently delete the data that is being owned by the other LEA because they are sending kids over to this common private school. So one LEA has a possibility of deleting the other LEA's student data. So let's go ahead and see this in detail with an example. I have chosen a Grand Bend ISD, which is a district, and I've chosen another ISD, which is a Glendale ISD. So these are our sample data sets that we have out of Ed-Fi core. And I've created a fake student here, John Smith, who is the resident of the Grand Bend ISD, and Michael Williams is a resident of the Glendale ISD. And Grand Bend is sending John Smith over to Northridge Private School for special education services. And similarly, Glendale is sending Michael Williams to Northridge Private School, the same school, for same special education services. This private school does not have the responsibility to send data directly to the state. Whereas the submitting agency or the resident districts have the responsibility to submit the data on behalf of John and Michael to the state. So what happens in this scenario? So what's happening is the Grand Bend ISD will have the ability to do get, post, put, and delete for both students in the Northridge private school. Similarly, Glendale will have the same actions they will be able to perform on both John and Michael's records. So this is a problem. So so we discussed the example scenario. Let's go into the authorization here, right? So Glendale will have a key and secret for submitting students' data for students who are going to their district, right? And similarly, Grand Bend will have a key and secret for that student information system for that district for submitting student data to the state, right? But then in addition to that, what we have seen is because that they have to submit data for students who are going to the private school, when you look at the admin database at the platform host level, you will have an association between the application, which in this case is a student information system, to the education organization ID of the private school, which means that submitting district the same key and secret is being shared for the private school, so that that key and secret will be able to, that student information system having that key and secret will be able to send the data for the private schools as well. So the same key and secret is associated to the private schools also. How does the enrollment record look like, and how does the Student Special Education Program Association record look like? Let's go ahead and take a look at that. So in Arizona's case, right, the enrollment record for John and Michael would be that it is for the attending school. It is that private school that will have the enrollment record. So John Smith going to Northridge Private School starting from this date, and he's enrolled in grade level 9th grade, and his entry type is this, right? Similarly, Michael Williams is also having his Student School Association record tied to the private school. So there is no scenario here where we are capturing the resident district or the submitting district information, right? But the key and secret for Glendale is associated to Northridge Private School, and the key and secret for Grand Bend is also associated to Northridge Private School. Their SPED record would be like this. John Smith, same. The education organization ID is the private school ID, and he's taking SPED services from Northridge Private School. So similarly for Michael Williams, his SPED record would be looking like this. And this is a similar use case that we've heard from, especially Infinite Campus. And I see Mindy joining the call here. And we heard this from them. What's happening is student information systems receive Ed-Fi resources from the ODS for data that are not owned by that student information system or the district, right? So when the get call is not restricted by the key and secret, that student information system is going to receive all the record owned by that by the different LEA in that private school, right? So if there are errors associated to that data, what happens? The incorrect data is remaining in the ODS if it is not corrected, and lots of hits to the API from the receiving end, right? And this is also filling up the error logs on the receiving sys side. And in addition to that, it's also confusing the district users, because when they are submitting the data, they're submitting the data with no errors, but the errors are being projected from the data that's being sent by the other LEA. So this needs to be restricted. The get calls need to be restricted based on who owns the data. So the concern here is data being created by one LEA is can be read and updated or deleted by another LEA. How could this be prevented? Vinaya, I know you have an answer for this question, so I'm going to pass the control over to you for you to explain how we are preventing this situation. Vinaya, over to you.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm the product owner for the ODS API, so I stay close to the code. And let me share my screen. There you go. Yeah, let me take a step back from the API perspective. In the ODS API, primarily resources are authorized based on relationship to education organization. So basically API clients are given a key and secret that is associated with the education organization, and they get access to students and staff who are enrolled, employed, or assigned to that education organization. And that level of granularity works very well in most of the use cases. But in the use cases, that's why you just explained, right? There are cases where it needs higher granular authorization, mainly when there are more than one client, API client, who is responsible for data submission for the same education organization, but not fully, right? Subset of students are like one API client is responsible for just a subset of students. Then there is this clash and stamping over each other's records, and the error submission issue that she mentioned just now, right? That happens. So as a solution, like Arizona came up with a solution, a design, and Ed-Fi reviewed the design, and then they made the changes, and then they brought back the code changes as open source community. They contributed the changes back, and the solution is basically overlaid authorization strategy that works on top of relationship-based, but provides this additional granularity. So let me go over on some of the details. So it is a feature which is, it's a configurable and optional feature. So there is this API settings here, which in the API settings, you can turn on the feature, and that's when the ownership-based authorization feature will be turned on. So it's not, by default, it is off, but it's an easy configuration switch to turn on. The feature also gives a new authorization strategy, which is ownership-based in the security database. So the strategy and the code is all wired up, but the API host who wants to configure this particular ownership strategy, they have to make certain setup in the security database for any resource action they want to configure this additional security, right? And once that is done, API basically authorizes access to the resources based on the concept of ownership, right? The creator of the record gets access to the record. Implementation details. As I said, like API clients are given ownership tokens, basically, and every time an insert happens from the client, its ownership token gets added to the record. So the record in the ODS gets stamped with the ownership token. And when a read, update, or delete request is made, the ownership token that's with the ODS in the record, right? ODS record gets checked against the ownership tokens of the client, and then if they match, client gets access. If they don't match, client does not get access. So that's how at high level the feature works. I saw a question popping up. If that's something that I can answer now.
Vinaya, the question is not to everyone on the chat. I think it was coming directly at you. So,
okay. Yeah, okay. I will take a look at it once I'm done with this presentation then. All right. So now I'll go over a little bit on how the workflow API workflow works, right, with the ownership-based authorization turned on. So basically, ODS API has three main databases it works with. Ed-Fi ODS database is where the actual student records are stored. Admin database is where client setup is present, and the security database is where security metadata is set up. And with this feature, all three databases had changes. Main change to the admin database is now it stores this creator ownership token against the API client, as well as a set of ownership tokens that are used to authorize existing resources, right? So that's what happened in the admin database. In the ODS database, every resource has now this ownership token field to capture the creator's ownership token. And the security database, the main change is to allow more than one authorization strategy per resource action. So now, so that it works with relationship and ownership, right? So that's the change that went into security database. So assuming what the API host has already set up and enabled the ownership-based token and created the key secret and gave the key secret to the vendor and with the ownership token associated, right? So the token stays in the admin database. So you could use the administrative tool or directly in the database. Ownership token is already set up and given to the vendor. How the API call looks like in the scenario, right? So vendor would send the authorization request with the key and the secret, and API would go to the admin database to validate that key and secret and send the token back. Along with that, it will pull the key context, which has a whole bunch of information about the client, right, including the LDOC the client is associated with, and now it will also include this these tokens, right, the creator's ownership token as well as the set of ownership tokens. And the API stores it in a cache. I mean, let's just call it key context. So it stores it in the cache. So this is the authorization flow, right? So once the authorization is done, say the vendor wants to now submit, well, the token goes back to the vendor. So once the authorization is done, say the vendor wants to post a new resource, right? So when the new post request comes, API fetches the ownership token, creator ownership token from this call context, and sets that, basically stamps that token along with the resource into the ODS. And the next time when vendor wants to get the put or post to an existing resource, API basically fetches the security metadata from the security database. And if this particular resource is configured for ownership-based token access, then it will check against the ODS, against the record, the ownership token in the record, and the ownership tokens of the client, and then return back only if client has access. So that's the flow. And high-level flow. If there is any question, I can answer now. I have a couple of slides on the database changes.
Vinaya, may I ask you a higher level question? Like, so if it is a LEA implementation, people are going to be using, the LEAs will be using the admin API to generate the key and secret for the vendors, right? Or vendor applications. So when they do that, will this ownership token be automatically created as part of that process? Or even in a state implementation, they would be creating the key and secret in multiple ways, right? So I just want to know if it is automatically created, or is this something that they're doing one-off way, inserting it in the backend database?
Yeah, so right now the admin app is not updated yet to create the ownership token, but it is in the plan for the upcoming release. It's not done yet, but there is plan of like having the admin app UI guide that. If you are directly doing it via the SQL, like there is a SQL sample template that we provide in our tech docs that can be used. So it's a very simple, like a small int field to fill, and the script is fairly simple as well, so it's not overly complex. Yeah, thank you. So the admin database, right? So in the admin database, the changes are mainly along with the API client. Now there is this creator ownership token that's stored with the client. So this is what is used for insertions, right? When a new record is created, it's stamped with this ownership token. And then there is also a list of tokens that's associated with the client. Mainly the scenario is if for some reason ownership token needs to be passed between the vendors in the cases of vendor switch, or there could be other cases where like one different vendor wants a read access, right? So that there might be cases where additional ownership token needs to be passed around. So that's why this list is provided. So for existing resource access, this list is used. This list, at minimum, it will also contain the same ownership token that's in the API client. Okay, so that's the admin database change. Ed-Fi ODS database change is basically every resource has this new field created by ownership token field that's populated when a new resource is created. This field is populated with the ownership token of the API client. So this is just an example of like student table, but it will be added to every resource table, or what we call as aggregate root table. In the security database, main change is to have more than one authorization strategy set up. So these two tables were like one single table. Now it's split with 1 to n relation, same way here. One is for the default metadata, and the other one is claim set level overrides. So that's just a schema change on the security database side. That's all I had on the overview. Sai, I'll pass it over to you for any additional comments.
Context. So before I get into the wrap up and Q&A, Vinaya, just looping back to the use case problem that I defined, should we just explain the implementation and apply it to the use case? I think it'll benefit the audience better. So I am going to go back to the use case diagram, and then let's talk about what we are going to see for the enrollment record and for the SPED record.
Okay.
Does that
Do you
sound
want
good
me
to
to
you?
pass the control? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Sounds good.
Okay. So if we take a look at this scenario, right? We have Grand Bend has an API key and secret, and Glendale has an API key and secret. So that API key and secret will have an ownership token associated to it, correct? So in this case, it's I don't have the API key and secret listed out here. Let's assume that that key and secret has ownership token of, this one has 100 being the ownership token, and this one has 200 being the ownership token, right? And if Grand Bend is sending John Smith to Northridge Private School, and if I go to the enrollment record, what I am going to be seeing here is 100 being the ownership token ID for John Smith, and 200 being the ownership token ID for Michael Williams for the same private school. So that tells me that 100 owns this record and 200 ownership owns this record. And similarly for the SPED record too, right? Vinaya? So, and similarly for the SPED education, Special Education Program Association, the created by ownership token will have 100 for this first record and 200 for the second record. So that tells that this was created by that specific client key and secret.
Right.
So when we are going to that resource level for giving the access for getting the reading the record or updating the record or deleting the record, what we are saying is, in addition to looking at the relationship between the student and the education organization and the key and the education organization relationship, also look at who owns that specific record. Whether it's the 100 that owns that specific record, then if the key and secret is associated to 100 ownership ID, then yes, this vendor can read the data, update the data, and delete the data. Otherwise, prevent it is what we are saying, right? So at the resource level, we are adding additional authorization strategy, which is that ownership authorization strategy, in addition to the out-of-the-box relationship based. So that way, that both of these problems will be should be solved for both vendors as well as for agencies. Like there shouldn't be a inadvertent delete by LEAs that don't own the data. And similarly, SIS vendors should not be getting resources that are not owned by them. So that finishes the presentation, but we would like to hear from you all, whether you have any questions related to it. And before I get into the Q&A side of things, let me just go to our Technical Congress side. So our registration for Technical Congress is open. The Technical Congress session is going to be on April 6th through April 8th in San Diego at the US Grant Hotel. So please go ahead, and the registration link is being provided here. And we would love to see you all in person. If that's not possible, please go ahead and register virtually also, because this is going to be open both for the in-person mode as well as for the virtual mode. And then I am opening the floor for question and answers.
Yeah, there was one question, Sai, on the Wisconsin implementation, and like Arizona implementation has some issues with, probably it looks like GET.
Yeah,
I think.
Get on Arizona's. I don't have the full scope of the GET on the Arizona side, but I can say that the GET is wide open on Arizona side. In Wisconsin side, GET is being prevented by the resource key and secret. So now we have added additional authorization strategy. So Arizona, we have informed them that this is Infinite Campus has informed them that this is a problem. So they're going to go back and analyze how they should restrict their GET calls. So once that is in place, once they restrict the GET calls based on the relationship and ownership, Infinite Campus should not be receiving resources owned by others.
Okay, so I'm not aware of like Wisconsin implementation. So if you know some details around that, can share.
So what I have heard from Audrey is, yes, they are not there at the level of implementing ownership authorization side, but of course they are preventing their GET calls based on the key and secret. So the restriction is at this point relationship based on the key and secret, their GET calls.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I think if there's no more questions, then we can wrap up. Again, we'll be sending out an email of this presentation, or if you have direct questions, Sai and Vinaya's contact information are in there, so feel free to reach out at any time. Thanks again for joining, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.